also unveiled the identity of the man we're going to be hearing this evening on this all-important topic. He's lived through the experience he's going to be sharing with us, and that brings to life what he's going to be saying and the proposals he's going to be making for what he believes can be done to help Ghana move forward. Please, shall we make welcome our guest speaker for today, Lawyer Tsatsu Tikata. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alfred, and Madam Chair. It's an honor to speak when you're chairing. I'd like to thank CSJ for the honor of this invitation, and particularly Soji. He is a medical doctor, but I think he takes his public health to include social justice. But I am particularly grateful to CSJ for bringing me back to a lecture hall at the School of Law, University of Ghana. In our day, it was the Faculty of Law. A bit of nostalgia is allowed, I suppose, but more than nostalgia, I do feel some pain and sorrow as well. In the 70s and early 80s, when I was a young lecturer on this campus, the nation was in severe crisis. Here I am today in my 70s, speaking on campus in a time when this dear nation is once again in severe crisis. You will understand more of the pain and sorrow from the observations I'll be making on how we got here. In an article on Ghana in the New York Times in September last year, the writer states plainly, the government is essentially bankrupt, owing, she says, 63.3 billion at the end of 2022, not just to foreign creditors, but also to homegrown lenders, pension funds, insurance companies, and local banks that believed the government was a safe investment, unquote. After describing some of the aspects of the economic crisis, highlighting, for instance, the rise in the cost of borrowing and its effect on business, the writer quotes the mission chief of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, as saying, quote, "This crisis is much deeper than the type of economic difficulties Ghana has faced in the past. This crisis is much deeper than the type of economic difficulties Ghana has faced in the past." It's sometimes necessary to start with observations about ourselves from an external eye, especially as sadly we often delude ourselves about our reality. Before our government went ahead to engage with the IMF, we heard many statements like, "We will not go to the IMF. We are a proud and sovereign nation. We have the resources as a nation to do without the IMF," it was proclaimed. In the end, apparently by a presidential order, as announced on July 1st, 2023, we did go to the IMF. Negotiations led to a 3 billion bailout package, And we proudly announce each disbursement as it is made. We are still a proud and sovereign nation after all. Frankly, there is no shame about having recourse to the IMF, an international financial organization that Ghana joined shortly after independence, and whose resources are available according to established criteria to member countries. Indeed, following the COVID-19 pandemic, Ghana was able to access billions of dollars of concessional funding from the IMF as well as from the World Bank, also a multilateral institution that Ghana is a member of. Yet we kept saying stridently that we would not go to the IMF. We were avoiding the IMF resources that required entering into a program under which our books would in effect have to be audited, performance criteria set, and our performance monitored for resources to be disbursed. We thought that we could continue to borrow from the Eurobond market where there was no such conditionality. So our crisis deepened. The CD continued to lose value. Inflation rocketed. Our debt to GDP ratio went through the roof. Even when, after borrowing $3 billion on the Eurobond market in each of 2019, 2020, 2021, there was a failed attempt in September 2021 to issue an additional $1 billion. We still would not go to the IMF. So we borrowed 2019 $3 billion, 2020 $3 billion, 2021 $3 billion. Then we tried to raise an additional billion September 2021 and we failed. But we still said no. Now, what has been particularly difficult for me to understand was that we spurned the IMF even though the cost of borrowing from that source is so much less than the cost of borrowing from the Eurobond market, which had been piling on our debts. And I'm going to use a few slides just to kind of say some of the things I want to say in more crisp forms than all this prose. So that's a slide that shows the kind of debt situation that Ghana faced, and I have to credit Brad Tsatsu, an American economist, who put together some of these summaries, based of course on data from the Bank of Ghana and so on, but I do have to credit him for using slides that he put together. So the external, we continued borrowing in effect to pay back previously borrowed money because we were not generating enough from the previous borrowing to pay back that money. A vicious debt spiral. It was also obvious that the escalating debts were not being used productively to generate additional value for the country. Even though an IMF program would also enable additional multilateral and bilateral funding on better terms, the dogged resistance to such a program continued with superficial nationalistic rhetoric. None of this can be responsible governance. How can it be in the national interest to continue on a path which was so obviously unsustainable? Only if some other interest was being served by preferring that path can one comprehend what was going on. Being in denial only works when the pain is not felt by you. It is also obvious that when you go to a lender when your position is at rock bottom, you have a weaker negotiating hand and are likely to obtain worse terms than if you went earlier when things were not so bad. The government even started railing against foreign rating agencies, floating a proposal to establish African rating agencies. All this in a bid to avoid facing up to the continuing economic decline which was being experienced by Ghanaians and on full display to the global markets. I have not yet read the manifestos of any of the parties. I wanted to offer these reflections on the state of the nation and the prospects that I envision even before I read any manifesto. Let me tell you why. Based on past experience and also the current political talk, I know that the manifestos will contain a lot of promises to the people of Ghana from those who are seeking their votes. What I am interested in, first of all, is some discussion of the resources that are going to be potentially available to the nation and how resources will be mobilized to implement the promises. When I get to read the manifestos, I'll be interested in the realism of the promises based on the potential resources. I dare to put myself in the shoes of the millions of Ghanaians who will be voting come 7th December 2024. Most of them will not read the manifestos, though they will probably hear some sound bites on the various promises. Many are not even literate in the language in which the manifestos are written. Some will be skeptical, especially as the manifestos may be recycling previous promises that were not fulfilled and that may yet again not be fulfilled. My hope is that over the next few months there will be conversation about the resources that are expected to be available, including the outlook for earnings from our natural resources, as well as any further engagement with the IMF and other sources of capital. Empty promises are worthless to the electorate. And even if they seem to win you votes, the time of reckoning comes and you end up being found wanting. While there are many features of our current national decline which are worthy of consideration, my focus today will be on the economic decline, which may disappoint some of you. I'm focusing on the economic decline and some of the prospects for addressing that so as to be able to rise from the ashes, as I will explain. We all have our different perspectives of the ashes, so we can all be part of the lecture. A few remarks will also be made to tie the project of economic reconstruction into the broad vision for the nation that will lift us to greater heights. I would like in this reflection to use the experience of a previous crisis to guide my outlook on what the future reconstruction will involve. I'm conscious of the limits of this historical reference point, especially bearing in mind that as the mission chief of the IMF is quoted in the New York Times as saying, this crisis is much deeper than the type of economic difficulties that Ghana has faced in the past. And just before I actually get into that, let me just show two more of Mr. Brad Setser's slides in order to explain exactly. If you stay on this one for a moment, this one, yeah. I talked about the piling up of international debt. And you can see in that line, which goes right to the top, that from 2017 to 2022, the borrowing from the capital markets, the bonds and so on, just shot up. That is the piling up of debt that I was talking about. And if you just go back one slide, you will see that, no, I said go back, not, right here. So you will see that Eurobonds dominate the picture of our debt, because we had a situation where we were more comfortable just issuing these bonds, and we were not comfortable with conditionality, or with a kind of situation in which we are going to be monitored and so on. So this crisis, as the mission chief of the IMF is quoted as saying, is in a way summarized in this picture of just over borrowing, in this picture of just, recklessness, frankly, as regards trying to live beyond our means. Because you borrow just to pay back previous borrowing, and I mean, you can't keep doing that. We know that even in our personal lives. So let me go to the previous crisis scenario, and let's see what lessons might be possible from that. I go back to the period of crisis in the 70s that I alluded to in my opening remarks, generally recognized as a really severe period, which thankfully we came out of. The Ghanaian economy was in steep decline in all sectors. For instance, cocoa, Ghana's economic lifeblood, accounting then for 2/3 of export earnings, suffered a major decline, mainly as a result of the low real price paid to the farmer. Purchases by the Cocoa Board went from 402,000 metric tons in 1975-76, having already gone down from over 500,000 tons in 71 to 258,000 metric tons in 1980-81. Smuggling was rampant. Severe drought conditions from 1980 and the devastation of bushfires also had their impact on cocoa production, and in addition led to serious food shortage. The country was literally in ashes. The forced return of over 1 million Ghanaians from Nigeria in early 1983 aggravated the food shortage. A World Bank study of the reality of Ghana at the beginning of 1982 provides the following summary. Few developing countries in the world have suffered such rapid economic decline in the past decade as Ghana has. We are not talking yet about now. This is at the beginning of 1982. Few developing countries in the world have suffered such rapid economic decline in the past decade as Ghana has. An average Ghanaian's real income has dropped by 1/3 during the last decade, 1970 to 80. The burden of declining incomes has fallen disproportionately on cocoa farmers, producers of goods and commodities, and urban fixed salary and wage earners. Per capita food availability, can you please leave out, because per capita food availability in 1982 is estimated to be 30% lower than 10 years ago. Cereal production in 1982 was only 63% of what was produced domestically in 1970. Most basic commodities are not readily available except maybe on the black market at prices many times above the control price. Inflation accelerated rapidly during the mid-70s, and rates of 100% or so became commonplace. The rate of acceleration was one of the highest among developing countries. The study also recognized, that's the end of the quotation, the study also recognized, and quotes again, unfortunately for Ghana, the steepest decline in cocoa and gold production took place at a time of unprecedented high world market prices. I really can't compete with Bob Marley. So it will be nice, you know, he is my favorite, but I can't. Yeah, okay. Unfortunately for Ghana, the steepest decline in cocoa and gold production took place at a time of unprecedented high world prices. So Ghana did not benefit from a potentially vast inflow of foreign exchange earnings in 1976 to 79. If Ghana had maintained the volume of cocoa exports it had attained in 71 during these 3 years, the additional foreign exchange earnings during those boom years would have amounted to approximately $600 million annually, expanding the import capacity by about 2/3 of the level attained in these years. Unquote. So it's from that crisis scenario that a program of economic recovery began to be drawn up following the 31st December 1981 revolution to reverse the desperate situation that the nation faced. Thus it was that in a decade often referred to as Africa's lost decade, Ghana began a period of economic recovery that put the dire realities of the 1980s and early 80s, of the 1970s and early 80s behind us, and set the country on a new course. The economic recovery program included in its design having recourse to financial resources from the IMF, and the first visit of a team from the IMF was in July of 1982. After negotiations in early 83, agreement was reached for an initial standby arrangement complemented by a compensatory financing facility. Financial resources began to be available to the government to begin implementing the program for resuscitating the economy. The real impetus for economic recovery, however, I would suggest, came from the mobilization of the nation at large in support of the needed measures and the restoration of the confidence of Ghanaians in the prospects of the nation. This is illustrated, for instance, in some of what happened in that period to revitalize the cocoa sector. An initiative of university students that was embraced by the ruling PNDC saw the students temporarily giving up on their studies and moving into cocoa producing areas alongside workers and soldiers and the citizenry at large to evacuate cocoa that had been locked up in the hinterland, either because of broken down infrastructure or the inefficiencies of the purchasing system. The involvement of PNDC Chairman Rawlings himself in even personally carrying cocoa on his back provided an impetus to this initiative. Apart from the nation earning vitally needed foreign exchange from the major export, this was also a recognition and affirmation of the central role of the cocoa farmer in generating the wealth of the nation. The recognition now being given to the farmer became a key part of the broader economic reform, with increasing producer prices and more effective payment systems. for cocoa farmers being instituted, Akwafu check and all that, all of which led to a major transformation in economic fortunes of the farmers and their communities. Representatives of cocoa farmers were on the Cocoa Price Review Committee established by the government to set the producer price. Progressively, the share of the farmer in cocoa export revenues steadily increased as against what went to the Cocoa Board and the government, meaning also significant resource transfers away from the urban to the rural population. The fundamental policy outlook was summarized in the National Program for Economic Development document of 1st July 1987 as follows, quote, "We're determined not to repeat the past mistake of so taxing the cocoa farmer that he loses interest in producing cocoa, and his nephews and children also have no incentive to follow in their uncles and fathers' footsteps. Farmer confidence in the future of the industry will be sustained by an increasing share of the world market price going to him directly," that's the farmer directly, not to Cocoa Board or to the budget. "This will also remove the temptation for cocoa to be smuggled to neighboring countries," unquote. Ghana again faces a crisis in the cocoa sector. Data from Cocoa Board showed that the production at the end of the last harvest was 429,323 metric tons, a level that is uncannily similar to the 1975-76 crop size that I referred to a few minutes ago. Compare this now, this 429,000 at the end of the last harvest to, and now I'm quoting from the chief executive of Cocoa Board, to the highest ever cocoa production level of 1.05 million metric tons during the 2020-2021 crop season. This was in a press release that he issued on the 22nd of August, celebrating the achievement of that 2020-2021 highest ever cocoa production. And now we're dealing in a situation where the last harvest, less than 3 years later, we're down to 429,000 metric tons. It is all the more astonishing that this dramatic plunge in production levels within 3 years comes after what the chief executive of Cocoa Board says about, and again I'm quoting him, a profit of Ghana cedis 2.3 billion during the 2022-2023 crop season, marking a significant turnaround from the previous year's performance and a demonstration of the effectiveness of the strategic initiatives undertaken by Cocoa Board. So you've reached a record-breaking 1 million tons 2020-2021. You've reached 2.5 billion profit, which we should all be proud of. What shall we say of the fact that last harvest you reached 429,323 metric tons? That's the reported number. So if there is an error, I would appreciate a correction, because that is what has been reported. And within the context of the affirmation that there are various strategic initiatives and they had been effective, that's why you made the 2 billion profit. So something is not quite hanging together in my mind, at least. With production in decline, the cocoa marketing company is not able to meet contractual obligations to buyers. For the first time in 32 years, the raising of a syndicated loan from the international capital markets for funding cocoa purchases for the 2024-25 crop year does not seem to be happening. This annual inflow of foreign exchange has also been an important part of the nation's foreign exchange management. The CEO of Cocoa Board tells us of, again to quote him, Cocoa Board's decision to wean itself of syndicated external borrowing to create more value for farmers, with no concrete information as to how what he calls a strategic policy shift will be implemented. Is Cocoa Board going to borrow from local banks? What capacity is there in the local banks? Or is the Bank of Ghana again going to do for Cocoa Board what it did for government, even when that is contrary to the statutory mandate of the Bank of Ghana? Is the Bank of Ghana going to be lending to Cocoa Board as it used to do more than 32 years ago? What are the economic consequences for Ghana of this so-called strategic policy shift? It was only in June 2024 that Cocoa Board itself went out seeking a syndicated loan of 1.5 billion. So when exactly was this strategic policy shift made? And why was it communicated to the public only as part of a response to a statement by the leader of the minority in parliament? What kind of corporate governance at Cocoa Board is reflected in this way of presenting such a significant departure from a 32-year practice that has provided foreign exchange resources for the country? Since the CEO's statement, the Minister of Finance has come out to say to journalists on 26 August 2024, quote, Cocoa Board is not abandoning the cocoa syndication. Negotiations are ongoing, but it will not bring in more than 600 million out of an initial target of 1.5 billion. Whose statement should we go by? The cocoa industry has been an important bedrock of the nation's economy. Much investment has been made by the nation in the industry, and its future is critical to the potential of Ghana to rise from the ashes. Clearly, with the dramatic decline in cocoa production, foreign exchange resources we may have been projecting from the sale of cocoa over the next few years will need revising and alternatives actively pursued. The challenges faced in Cocoa Board's operations ought to be candidly and transparently assessed and addressed with all the technical capabilities at Cocoa Board's disposal, rather than from a perspective that is loaded with partisan politics. Plans for the future should also be formulated with such technical capabilities fully deployed to ensure improved performance and greater value for the farmer and the nation. It seems to me time to re-envision the whole basis for the Cocoa Board operation, to move away from just export of cocoa beans, which has been the thrust of Cocoa Board's existence through the decades, and facilitate the development of cocoa processing capacity for various value-added products nearer to the farming areas. A truly strategic shift would involve, among other things, well thought out, comprehensive redesigning of the enormous infrastructure created for bean purchase and export to serve additional or other purposes. The potential to create jobs through such redesign and to improve livelihoods in the communities and farming areas near the existing infrastructure should be a current preoccupation for us as a country. The fertile minds of entrepreneurs, rural development specialists, planners, engineers, and others, always having the farmer at the center, can help us achieve this value addition strategic shift. There's a further aspect of the recent press release of and very destructive of cocoa farms. This is very well known, even by, and cannot be lost on anyone. With its database on cocoa farms, Cocoa Board must have detailed information on the impact of galamsey. Yet, the press release of the CEO is silent on this important cause of reduced production. More and more people, the youth and some chiefs in communities around the cocoa growing areas particularly, journalists, civil society organizations, health professionals are expressing their dismay over the destructive impact of galamsey. We see recent images of health professionals looking at children in communities who are suffering diseases resulting from the kind of water that is used for bathing them. The devastation being caused to farmlands, rivers, and our whole environment by galamsey is being documented constantly. Serious concern is also being expressed about the health consequences. It seems to me that it is time for a major national mobilization against galamsey, similar to what was initiated by students in 1982-83 in support of the cocoa industry, but on a much bigger scale. Leadership at all levels is called for, and extensive community engagement in all the affected areas would be required. Appreciation by local communities of the enormous harm from these criminal activities will ensure that the communities are not swayed by inducements offered by the unscrupulous destroyers of the environment, local or foreign, who do not live in that environment and are not as badly affected by the destruction they cause as are the community members. Clear plans are needed to begin to offer these communities alternatives to collaboration with or engagement in galamsey. Livelihoods from agriculture, including cocoa, ought to become meaningful and attractive options, especially for the youth. Concessional funding is likely to be available for this campaign as part of rehabilitating the cocoa sector. You see, I mean, on the face of it, we seem to have tried a lot of things. we have sent soldiers into these areas. We have made big statements. We have set up ministerial task forces. And we have had, again, images of not tractors. My cocoa mind is looking at tractors. We've had images of excavators and so on in these areas being burned to ashes as part of, apparently, the determination to fight Galamsey. But we also have accounts of how some of the seized tractors, 400 or whatever, just vanished into thin air. So, clearly, unless there is a concerted national mobilization in respect of this, a lot of stuff is going to fall between the cracks. The line needs to be drawn clearly between licensed small-scale mining and criminal galamsey. In line with the rationale for licensing value-creating small-scale mining, which was again something that came out of the previous economic crisis. That system for licensing small-scale farming, for enhancing technical abilities and so on, came out of the institutional changes that were established from the past period of crisis. So in line with the rationale for licensing value-creating small-scale mining, the technical capacities of those applying for small-scale mining licenses to be able to undertake such activity must be assessed from the onset and enhanced on an ongoing basis. So a small-scale mining license is not just a favor to a party person. Or it shouldn't be, let me say that, because when I say it's not just, I sound like I'm describing something that I know is not true. But it shouldn't be just a favor given to somebody who can then use it in other ways than what it is intended to be. So the technical capacities of those applying for these licenses ought to be assessed from the onset and enhanced on an ongoing basis. Innovative schemes for small-scale miners, whether through pools of equipment and or finance being made available in return for a share of their production, can be instituted. Lessons may be drawn from similar support provided for cocoa farmers. A rigorous monitoring of all small-scale mining activities is required so that they do not descend to the level of galamsey. This means the capacity of regulatory bodies at national and local levels must be strengthened. The experience of Ghana's economic recovery from that early period that I have been referring to also illustrates how resources made available by the IMF facilitated additional resources from the World Bank and other donors, usually longer-term resources. Intensive work was needed to put in place comprehensive plans for the growth of the economy after the initial stabilization phase. Reforms were undertaken in various sectors for improved performance. The mineral sector, for instance, underwent overhaul of the laws and institutions, resulting in renewed investment, especially in gold mining. And gold became the #1 foreign exchange earner ahead of cocoa. A set of laws and institutional arrangements also took petroleum exploration and production out of the general mining legal regime and established a National Petroleum Corporation to accelerate exploration activity with a view to achieving significant oil and gas production in Ghana. Such production was to yield revenue benefits for government, as well as other national benefits, including jobs, maximizing resource recovery in accordance with the best international practices, and protecting the environment. In this period, as part of these comprehensive plans that were instituted, it wasn't just a matter of taking IMF money, but plans for the growth of the economy. So those plans included plans for the power sector, including the extension of the electricity grid to the northern parts of the country, and a national program for electrification, which would bring electric power progressively to areas which were not previously connected. I find it important to recall some of these things because, first of all, we may either forget, or because we are so young as students, if there are students here, but I see a lot of gray hairs, and I know that people know these things, but we should remind ourselves of these things because they tell us a bit about how we came out of where we were before and moved into new dimensions. VRA didn't used to have its electricity extended to the northern parts of Ghana, incredible as it may sound today, because we take it for granted. As at 1982, the northern part of Ghana was not part of the electricity grid which had access to Akosombo power. That's just a fact. And the plans that were part of the agenda to get us out of the ashes of those days included this extensive activity of national electrification. The Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning in those days prepared the public investment program with input from the various sectors as a basis for sourcing financing needed for undertaking specific projects. With multilateral and bilateral donors coming on board, a framework for donor coordination, which included the annual donors conference, was put in place. Entry into an IMF program without comprehensive plans for the growth of the economy would have been of little value. That is also an important lesson for us in the midst of our current program. It must be recognized that an IMF program does come with conditionality that can be harsh, especially when it is addressing the realities that have been swept under the carpet for a long time. The obvious unsustainability of Ghana's debt situation, which I showed in those earlier slides, made its restructuring an inevitable part of the conditions for a bailout. As between external debts, which you saw constituted about 58%, and domestic debt, the government chose to prioritize domestic debt restructuring. Individual bondholder groups, trade unions, and the opposition NDC sought to prevail on the government to pay more attention to cutting expenditures, strengthening oversight on government finances, adopting other revenue measures so as to avoid or minimize the need for domestic restructuring. The leading IMF policy paper on debt restructuring, published in December 2021, actually recommends that countries avoid domestic debt restructuring if possible, especially because of its impact on domestic financial institutions. However, our government opted to prioritize the domestic debt exchange program. Domestic debt exchange. We don't like restructuring and all these words. Debt exchange, And that choice that was made has had obvious consequences. After we were given assurances of no haircut There were in fact substantial haircuts on investments with attendant impacts on livelihood and purchasing power. I cannot forget an encounter I had about 9 months ago with a retired public servant. He recalled with pride how he had been involved in working on the economic recovery program in the 1980s and 90s, performing his role tirelessly to help the country, and the long hours that were required during that time. He felt those hours were worth it. But having his meager pension now reduced by decisions of the government, which is the government that had plunged the country into the current crisis, he thought was not fair. He was visibly emotional at what he felt was insensitivity to the situation of people like him. This was indeed why even a former Chief Justice found it necessary to join in picketing at the Ministry of Finance in solidarity with pensioners. Local banks also suffered the impact of this debt exchange, and that impact included having the confidence of the public in them undermined. Considering that enormous resources had been expended by the government in what it referred to as a cleanup of the banking sector a few years ago, weakening those banks that you have cleaned up within a few years of the cleanup is rather strange. More especially when an IMF expert has made the case for avoiding domestic debt restructuring if possible. Of course, you know, when you're on the outside, you don't know all the factors that led to those choices. So, in a sense, I'm raising a question which is open to discussion and to further clarification. That choice is the choice that the government made to prioritize the domestic debt restructuring or the domestic debt exchange. The negotiations with external creditors are also now close to being concluded, we are told. The new schedules for the debt repayment will form the framework of economic planning for the new government from January 2025. It must be emphasized that even after the conclusion of the debt restructuring and re-establishment of access to international capital markets, the new government will have to ensure prudent economic management with efficient and effective use of limited resources, rather than resorting to the very kind of borrowing that has led to the current crisis. That is why we must look closely at what are potentially available resources for the recovery that we are optimistically looking forward to. I want to focus a bit now on the potential in the oil and gas sector. That should not surprise you. Others are better qualified to speak more extensively about the potential in the mineral sector or the agricultural sector, for example. When I delivered a lecture in July 2022 to commemorate the passing of President Mills, I expressed concern at declining oil production. I pointed out that it was the oil and gas development projects arising from 11 discoveries made during the 3.5 years of the Mills presidency that led to the oil and gas production from the 10 and Sankofa Jinyame fields. With these two fields and the first Jubilee field in production by 2017, the levels of oil revenues escalated from that year. In that lecture, I indicated that you need a similar pipeline of appraisal to development projects so as to begin to reverse the decline in oil production. Since then, I'm afraid the decline has continued. As the 2023 report of the Public Interest and Accountability Committee states, quote, the 2023 production figure represents the fourth consecutive year of reduction of annual production volumes since 2010. The fourth consecutive year of reduction of annual production volumes. The 2023 figure was a little over 48 million barrels, having declined from a high of over 71 million 2020, that is a high in 2019 of 71 million. So 2020 saw about a 6.32 decline to almost 67 million barrels. And this decline had followed 4 consecutive years of increased production. So you have 4 years of increase and then a decline. Now, in oil industry terms, I mean, you can't just explain this in terms of, declines in, the production of different reservoirs or whatever. That is not a sufficient explanation. So, we'll come to the issues related to that in a moment. Now, with high oil prices in 2022, even though there was a significant decline in production, revenues actually exceeded the 2019 revenues. So if we look at, can we now see those the last couple of slides? Yeah. So this is from the Public Interest and Accountability Committee's report for 2023, and you will see, in terms of the green bars, you will see from the highest point 2019, it comes down a little bit 2020, then a little bit more in 2021, a little bit again in 2022, and then 2023 continues. So that is quite a significant picture to have in mind. And then when you look at the next image, you will see the point that I just made. Even though 2022 the production had declined because of Ukraine war and so on, the revenues actually went up. So Ukraine didn't always create adverse impacts. It created some positive. So even though the production declined so significantly vis-a-vis 2019, again the fact is that in 2022 the actual revenues for oil from a much lower production was higher than at the highest level of production. So again, let's just deal with the facts about the Ukraine war and COVID-19. I'm not going to talk about COVID-19. I know some people are very exercised about that these days on social media, but anyway, so this reality that I'm talking about also points to some of the complexities arising from global trade and the impact that there can be on us from these complexities. Now, there is also something very striking. I want you to keep the revenues slide. Yeah. Just keep it there for a while. What is also striking is that since 2017 to 2023, that is within this current government, something like 6.39 billion accrued to Ghana. Almost twice the amount of revenue that accrued to the two previous governments from 2011 to 2016. So, out of the cumulative revenue of almost 10 billion, let's say 9.85, almost 10 billion, 6.35 of that was revenue that was available to this government, compared to 3 point something that was available to the previous two governments from 2011 to 2016. This government also had access to the stabilization fund set up from oil revenues during COVID-19. So, again, just to put things in perspective, in terms of availability of resources for addressing, the country's situation, oil in the last 6 years has provided much, much more than in the previous 5 years or so. But as we see this decline, and even in spite of the spike that Ukraine provided for revenues in 2022, we also have to recognize that what I talked about in terms of needing a pipeline of projects that are going from appraisal to development has really not been happening. There is only one potential development that is set to be underway. That is the Pecan development. Now, that Pecan development, and we can just move to the next. I want to. This, is it possible to expand this a little bit? Is it possible? I just want to illustrate something. Okay, so Alfred, you have the pointer. So if you go to the left corner where the brown is, the Hess block, it says Hess. Okay. To the left. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that is the block. No, just down. Yeah. Yeah. There, exactly. So that is where, and you can see Pecan just to the bottom there. Pecan. Yeah. Okay. So that is where the focus is for this development. Now, I'm giving you some detail about this for a reason which you'll see in a minute. Now, by the time Hess was leaving, they had made 7 discoveries in that block. 7 discoveries. Now, in the industry, of course, when you make a discovery, you have to do further work, appraising, and so on. And Hess altogether probably spent $800 million in making those discoveries. So, if you like, the nation was bequeathed with potential value in terms of what those 7 discoveries represent and the potential for them to become actual oil production. What happened? Now, Hess decided to exit Ghana at a time when they had made some major discoveries in Guyana. And they and ExxonMobil, really got excited about that. So they sold their interest to Aker Energy. Now, Aker Energy was a company formed by a Norwegian billionaire, and it's important to know that he was a billionaire because you will understand it better as we go along. So this Norwegian billionaire buys Hess's interest, I think for 25 million or something, because Hess was in a hurry to leave. So they sold it for 25 million, and then the possibility of some contingent payment later if production was achieved by this company. Now, Aker Energy, as Aker Energy, has really not had any experience of developing and producing a field. They are partners with BP in the North Sea, and they came into Ghana as more or less their first potential kind of operating experience. I'm okay. Yeah, thank you. So Aker comes in and they start evaluating, and they undertake a couple more wells, drilling of a couple more wells. And by the way, for the purposes of their coming in, it was decided to modify the terms of the agreement to give them some additional incentives so that they would go ahead to generate production from at least one of those discoveries that had been made. Aker put up some plans for development, and to cut a long story short, they were rejected by the Energy Commission because they did not meet certain technical and also legal criteria. So they were rejected. They went back and forth, they got rejected. And some of their plans clearly included sort of just holding on to all the 7 discoveries, not necessarily giving any specific program to what they are doing with those discoveries. Then, about 18 months ago or so, Aker itself decided to exit the block, and they sold their interest to Africa Finance Corporation for $1. And they exited with the approval of the government and GMPC. Now, it gets actually more interesting than that, because before Aker left, you may recall that one of the first acts of Minister Opoku Prempeh as Minister of Energy was to present to Parliament a proposal for GMPC to acquire a significant stake in that block for $1.65 billion.